At 4:15 in the morning on June 5, 1944, Dwight Eisenhower sat in a room at Southwick House near Portsmouth and made the most consequential weather forecast decision in the history of warfare. He had postponed the invasion once already. The original date was June 5th. The weather over the English Channel had been so bad, high winds, heavy seas, low cloud cover that would have grounded the airborne operations and made naval gunfire support impossible, that postponing was the only defensible choice. That decision had been straightforward. What he faced now was not straightforward. His meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg, was presenting a forecast that showed a narrow window of marginally acceptable weather opening on June 6th. Not good weather, marginally acceptable. Winds dropping enough for the naval operation, ceiling lifting enough for limited air support, lasting perhaps 36 to 48 hours before the next system came in. The window was real. It was also uncertain. Stagg himself was not fully confident in the forecast. The models were disagreeing, and the margin of error was significant. Eisenhower's senior commanders were divided. Montgomery wanted to go. Lee Mallory, commanding the Air Forces, was uncertain. Admiral Ramsey said it was feasible, but barely. And if Eisenhower waited for better weather, the next viable window was 2 weeks away. 2 weeks during which German intelligence might detect the concentration of forces in southern England. 2 weeks during which the elaborate deception operation that had convinced the Germans the real landing would come at Pas-de-Calais might unravel. 2 weeks during which 150,000 men already briefed on the operation would have to be kept confined and isolated to prevent security leaks. Eisenhower looked around the room at his commanders. He said, "Okay, we'll go." 4 words. The largest amphibious operation in human history began with 4 words from a man who was not certain the weather would hold. This is the story of how Eisenhower made that decision, and why it was harder than any history book makes it seem. To understand the pressure Eisenhower was under at 4:15 on the morning of June 5th, you need to understand what the stakes of the decision actually were. Not in the abstract terms of winning the war, but in the concrete operational terms of what would happen if he was wrong in either direction. If he launched on June 6th and the weather deteriorated faster than forecast, the consequences were specific and catastrophic. The airborne operations, 13,000 paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne, dropping behind the beaches in darkness, required enough visibility for the aircraft to navigate and enough ceiling for the drop zones to be identifiable. If the weather closed in during the drop, the paratroopers would scatter across the Norman countryside in configurations that bore no relationship to their operational objectives. Many would drown in the flooded fields behind Utah Beach. Others would land miles from their units with no ability to link up before daylight exposed them. The naval gunfire support that the beach landings depended on required a sea state that allowed the smaller landing craft to maintain course and the larger ships to hold accurate firing positions. If the swells were too high, the landing craft would swamp on the approach. American soldiers would drown before reaching the beach. The destroyers providing close fire support would be unable to hold position. The first waves at Omaha would face a wall of German fire with no effective suppression. And if the low cloud cover persisted, the 11,000 aircraft of the Allied Air Forces, the most powerful air armada ever assembled, would be unable to operate effectively. The bombing of the beach defenses that was supposed to suppress the German positions before the infantry arrived would be compromised or impossible. These were not hypothetical risks. They were the specific ways in which a decision to launch in marginal weather could produce not a difficult landing, but a catastrophic one. On the other hand, if Eisenhower waited, 2 weeks of continued concentration of forces in southern England, the German intelligence services, which had been partially blinded by the destruction of their agent networks in Britain, might still detect the scale of the preparation. The window of strategic surprise that Fortitude had purchased, the German belief that the main landing would come at Pas-de-Calais, was not infinite. Every additional day increased the risk that something would break the deception. And there was a political dimension. The Soviet Union had launched the summer offensive on the Eastern Front in coordination with the Western landings. Stalin had been promised a cross-channel invasion in June 1944. Delaying significantly would create diplomatic consequences that Eisenhower's political superiors would have to manage. The decision was not between a good option and a bad one. It was between 2 bad options with different failure modes. Dwight Eisenhower had been preparing for this decision for months. Not the specific weather decision, which could not be anticipated, but the decision framework that would allow him to make the right call when the moment came. His preparation was not primarily military, it was psychological. Eisenhower had spent the months before D-Day thinking systematically about what kind of commander he needed to be at the moment of maximum pressure. Not the most brilliant tactician. He had Montgomery and Patton and Bradley for that. Not the most aggressive. He had Patton for that. What he needed to be was the person in the room who could hold the competing demands of the operation in mind simultaneously, who could resist the pressure to optimize for any single variable, and who could make a decision in conditions of genuine uncertainty without being paralyzed by that uncertainty. That is a different skill from tactical brilliance, and it is much rarer. The specific challenge of the weather decision was that it required Eisenhower to make a probabilistic judgment, not a certainty but a bet, under conditions where the downside scenarios were severe in both directions. The meteorological models were genuinely uncertain. Stagg was not hedging when he expressed doubt. The 36 to 48-hour window was real but fragile. What Eisenhower had to calculate was not which option was better, neither was good, but which failure mode was more recoverable. A landing in weather that deteriorated faster than forecast was recoverable if the deterioration was not immediate and catastrophic. The forces could fight through difficult conditions if the initial landings established a foothold. A 2-week delay risked compromising the strategic surprise that the entire operation depended on. He chose the launch. Captain Harry Butcher, Eisenhower's naval aide who was present at Southwick House during the weather conferences and kept a detailed diary of those days, described the atmosphere in the room at the critical moment in his published account of the war. The tension in that room was unlike anything I had experienced in the war, and I had been through a lot of tense moments. It wasn't the tension of men who were afraid. It was the tension of men who understood the full weight of what was being decided, and who were trying very hard not to let that weight interfere with clear thinking. Eisenhower sat quietly listening to everyone else before he spoke. When he finally said, "Okay, we'll go," the room exhaled. Not with relief exactly, with the recognition that the decision had been made, and there was nothing left to do but execute it. Butcher's description captures the specific quality of Eisenhower's decision-making that his critics, who found him insufficiently aggressive, insufficiently brilliant, insufficiently dramatic, consistently missed. That the ability to hold uncertainty without being paralyzed by it, and to decide without certainty, is itself a form of excellence that most people cannot access under pressure. If this is giving you a different way to think about how the biggest decisions in history actually get made, subscribe and hit the bell. New video every week at this level of detail. Back to the story. The actual D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, produced results that ranged across the full spectrum of possible outcomes, from the near-catastrophic at Omaha Beach to the relatively smooth at Utah, from the partial success of the British and Canadian beaches to the scattered but ultimately effective airborne operations. At Omaha, the combination of navigational errors, sea conditions that swamped the supporting DD tanks, and German defensive positions that had survived the pre-landing bombardment produced casualties that in the first hours approached the worst-case projections. The first waves of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions came ashore in conditions where the suppressing fire they depended on was largely absent, and where the German defenders of the 352nd Infantry Division were in positions that dominated every approach. What saved Omaha was not the plan. The plan had largely failed by 9 a.m. What saved Omaha was the initiative of individual officers and NCOs who, finding themselves in an impossible situation, decided to move anyway. Up the bluffs, around the flanks, through the German wire, because stopping meant dying where they were. Colonel George Taylor's order at Omaha Beach has become one of the most quoted commands of the entire war. 2 kinds of people are staying on this beach: the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here. By the end of June 6, 1944, the Allies had established a continuous beachhead across all 5 landing zones. It had cost approximately 10,000 Allied casualties, lower than the most pessimistic pre-landing projections, but far higher than the optimistic ones. Eisenhower had written, before the launch, a message accepting personal responsibility if the invasion failed. He had put it in his pocket. He never needed to deliver it. The weather, as it turned out, held well enough. Not perfectly. The conditions on June 6th were significantly worse than a typical planning assumption for a major amphibious operation. The swells at Omaha were higher than predicted. The cloud cover over the airborne drop zones was patchy in ways that scattered some units. The sea state made the approach of the smaller landing craft more difficult than the exercises had simulated. But it held. The 36 to 48-hour window that Stagg had forecast did not close immediately. And what followed, the consolidation of the beachhead, the breakout from Normandy, the liberation of Paris, was made possible by the fact that the initial landings had established a foothold that the Germans, surprised by the timing and still half convinced that Normandy was a feint, did not concentrate against immediately. The German response in the critical first days was hampered by two factors that Eisenhower's planning had specifically anticipated. The first was the Fortitude deception, the fictional FUSAG under Patton that had convinced German intelligence the main landing would come at Pas-de-Calais. 3 days after D-Day, with an Allied beachhead clearly established in Normandy, Hitler was still holding his panzer reserves for the second landing that never came. The divisions that could have driven the Allies back into the sea in the first week were waiting in the wrong place for an army that didn't exist. The second was the paralysis of German command that resulted from the absence of Rommel, who was in Germany for his wife's birthday on June 6th, having calculated based on the weather forecast that no landing was imminent, and the confusion over who had authority to release the panzer reserves, which required Hitler's personal authorization and which Hitler refused to give until it was too late. These were not accidents. They were the products of months of planning, the deception operation, the targeting of German command and control, the timing chosen specifically to coincide with the window when Rommel would be away. Eisenhower had designed a system that was robust to his own weather uncertainty, precisely because it didn't depend on the weather being perfect. It depended on the Germans being slow. And the Germans were slow because everything else in the plan had worked. General Omar Bradley, who commanded American ground forces on D-Day and observed the Omaha situation from the command ship Augusta as the morning reports came in, described the hours between 8 and 10 a.m. on June 6th in his memoir, with a frankness about how close the situation came to unraveling. During those 2 hours, I was closer to ordering a withdrawal from Omaha than at any other point in the war. The reports coming in were fragmentary and uniformly bad. Heavy casualties, units pinned down, no forward movement, the supporting tanks gone. If I had known then what I know now about what was actually happening on the beach, that small groups of men were already moving up the bluffs, that the situation was desperate but not yet lost, I might have held. But I didn't know. I was reading fragmentary reports from a ship offshore, making decisions about a battle I couldn't see. That is what command at that level actually looks like. Bradley's admission captures something about D-Day that the victory narrative tends to obscure: how close the decisions at every level came to going the other way. Eisenhower almost didn't launch. Bradley almost withdrew from Omaha. The individual soldiers on the beach almost didn't move up the bluffs. The outcome that history remembers as inevitable was, at each of those moments, genuinely uncertain. D-Day has a specific place in American cultural memory that separates it from almost every other battle of the war, and that place is deeply connected to the communities that fought it. The 29th Infantry Division that took the heaviest casualties at Omaha was a National Guard division drawn primarily from Virginia and Maryland. Men who had trained together for years before deploying, who knew each other's families, who carried the specific weight of being neighbors fighting alongside neighbors. The losses at Omaha fell disproportionately on specific small towns in Virginia and Maryland, in a way that shaped those communities for generations. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, was a regular Army division with a disproportionate number of soldiers from immigrant communities, including significant numbers of Hispanic Americans from the Southwest and from New York. Their service at Omaha, which is documented in the division's after-action reports, is part of the larger story of what D-Day cost and who paid it. The 82nd and 101st Airborne, whose paratroopers scattered across the Norman countryside in the hours before the beach landings, included men from every state and every background. The paratrooper who landed miles from his unit and fought his way back to American lines alone is not a figure of legend. He is a statistical certainty, given the scale of the drop. Thousands of men did exactly that. These are American stories. D-Day was not won by a plan. It was won by individual Americans making decisions under impossible pressure in the dark. The lesson of Eisenhower's decision on the morning of June 5, 1944, is not about weather forecasting or military planning. It's about the specific quality of leadership that becomes relevant only when the information is incomplete, the stakes are maximum, and the decision cannot be deferred. Eisenhower had spent his career preparing for exactly this kind of moment, without knowing it would take this specific form. The years of staff work, the experience in North Africa and Sicily, the months of planning overload, all of it had been preparation for the 4:15 a.m. moment, when the models were disagreeing, and his commanders were divided, and he had to decide. What made him capable of that decision was not certainty. He was not certain. What made him capable of it was the prior work of defining for himself what the decision criteria actually were. Which failure mode was more recoverable? Which risk was more manageable? Which uncertainty was more tolerable given everything else he knew about the plan? The weather window was real but fragile. The strategic surprise purchased by Fortitude was real, but time-limited. The 2-week delay risked more than the marginal weather. He decided, "Okay, we'll go." The message he had written accepting personal responsibility for failure, the one he never delivered, is one of the most revealing documents in the history of American military leadership. It shows a man who understood that the decision was his alone, that the outcome was uncertain, and that the willingness to be accountable for a wrong outcome was the only honest way to claim credit for a right one. History remembers D-Day as the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. What it doesn't always remember is that it began at 4:15 in the morning, with a man looking at a weather forecast he wasn't sure about, surrounded by commanders who weren't sure either, deciding that uncertain action was better than certain delay. That decision, not the landings themselves, but the decision to launch, is the one that made everything else possible.